Hello, I'm going to be talking about dates, that is, the sort you find on something like this. And I'm going to be talking about horses. Yeah, the sort you ride on, and motor cars. I don't need to illustrate that now, do I? And we'll start with the dates, you see, because a couple of videos ago, I took everyone in North America to task for having just about the most irrational dating display system it's possible to think of. Month, day, year. What sort of sense does that make? Well, it's all right if you're writing, July the 1st, 1983 or whatever, but when it's going down in numbers, it comes out as 7190. It goes from month, middle size to small, day size to year, big size. Now, in Britain, we have a much more rational way of doing it, which is when we're doing it in numbers. It's, the day first, then the month, then the year. And I very often do that the other way round when I'm putting dates on folders in my computer, because actually the most rational is probably the year, the month, then the day. Okay, so I just made that passing comment. And to my astonishment, there were several responses under the video. One or two said, yeah, it is a bit weird, but the others said, yeah, and how about you driving on the wrong side of the road? Which is actually it's sort of whataboutery, isn't it? And you should be ashamed of yourselves. I would have thought my viewers were a lot more intellectual than that. Afterwards, I thought, maybe I should explain why. Because you see, I'll go back on that. I actually started to explain under the comments why the Brits drive on the left side of the road, and the Japanese and the Australians. In fact, all the islands, so many of the islands. I don't know about Iceland, but yeah, let that lie. I started explaining, and then, when I got to about the fourth, I started to get tired, and I thought, I'll just make a video. So that is what I'm going to do now. And of course, it all starts with the horse. Now, let's face it, we've been driving motor cars for, 90 years, really, 100 years, sort of general motor cars. And we've been, in Britain, there were laws about what side of the road to go on from the early part of the 19th century. I have seen two dates. I've seen the late 1700s and the early 1800s. But there might have been some difference in what they were talking about. But yeah, it was around sometime 20 years on either side of the 1800 mark. So that's not very long in human society, is it? And up until then, people rode horses and drove carts, but it's principally riding the horses that we're concerned about. And why? Because it was the aristocrats that did most of the horse riding. A farmer might have had a cart horse, probably not that suitable for riding and more likely to have been pulling a cart. Now, let's consider how you get on a horse. I'll find an illustration of how to mount a horse. It's all pretty much the same. So I'm just going to imagine I have a picture there, or a photograph or something. But basically what you do is, holding the saddle and more or less facing the back of the horse, you put your left foot in the stirrup, and then you swing, you spring up, turning, and throw your right leg over to the other side of the saddle. So you're facing the front. believe me, I've seen people get on the horse wrong. They've actually put their right foot in the stirrup and then swung over and found themselves facing backwards. It has happened. So you've got this system where you put your left foot in the stirrup and swing round. Why do you think it always started with the left foot? Because it was usually soldiers who rode horses. And soldiers, generally speaking, carried swords. And as is the way of humanity, so more soldiers were right-handed than left-handed. So they carried the swords on their left hip. Now, if you put your foot in the stirrup and you've got your sword hanging down, it will hang down out of the way of your left foot, which is in the stirrup. And it will stay out of the way while you spring up, then it'll swing round with your hip, and then your right leg goes over the saddle, and you're sitting on the horse without that sword having got in your way. If you tried to mount the horse from the right, imagine your right foot you're facing the back of the horse again, your right foot is in the stirrup, and your sword is hanging down by the side of your left leg. You swing up and turn to face the front of the horse. What happens to the scabbard with the heavy sword in it? That'll snarl your leg. It might slap the back of the horse as you are swinging over. You could find yourself in an extremely embarrassing and undignified position if the horse got slapped by your sword as you were only with one foot in the stirrup. It's even worse if the sword fell forward and then you found yourself swinging your left leg over the saddle with your sword already in the way, sticking out over the saddle. So altogether, that's not good. And so you would tend to mount the horse from the left. Then, of course, you stay on that side of the road, and that's why you ride on the left. Now, other people have said, and this is definitely part of the same thing, if you're riding along and you wish to draw your sword because somebody's coming towards you who isn't that friendly, then you will do that with your right hand, and then you'll be able to engage the other person. Whereas if you were on the other side of the road, and took your sword out with your right hand, you'd be having to sort of move sideways to use your sword. But you could still do that. It's the getting on the horse that's the big deal. That's the reason you mount from the left and then stay on the left of the road. Now, as it just so happens, Napoleon Bonaparte was a left-handed man. He would have found it far more convenient to mount a horse from the right because that's the side he would have had his sword hanging and for all I know, that's what he did. So he was most sympathetic to the idea of riding on the right. But the basic reason was when his conquering troops were entering other countries, and of course everybody was riding on the left of the road, then his soldiers would be barging along, on the left side of the road, their right, if you see what I mean, barging into the peasants, which forced the peasants to go over to the right side of the road and enforced upon them the knowledge that they were well and truly conquered. And so Napoleon decreed that his soldiers, when coming into a country, would always march on the right side of the road, forcing oncoming traffic over to their right side of the road. So, in fact, this idea of staying on the right side of the road is a concession to bullying and oppression. just so you know, you Americans, and anyone else, Germans, anyone who was in the Napoleonic orbit ended up putting vehicles over onto the right side. And the ones that didn't, like Czechoslovakia, that was always, they rode on the left and were forced to go onto the right by the Germans. Again, a similar thing. It's the motion equivalent of enforced speech. The Germans wanted the Czechoslovakians to conform to them. Sweden too. They were on the left, but they moved to the right in the 70s, mostly because everybody else around them was on the right, and it was very inconvenient. Even the cars, they had standard continental wheel position, so it made a lot more sense for them. That's why the British still ride and drive their cars on the left, and the Japanese do. Again, for the same reason, it made more sense. And being a set of islands, they didn't have to conform to the continental concession to bullies. But we have our own concession to bullies here in Britain, because I had a couple of comments about the two-tap system in Britain. I'll find some photos. I find this particularly irritating. I've lived all over the world, and I find this tap business as much of a nuisance as any other visitor to this country. And that is, they have a cold tap and a hot tap, and they're on different sides of the sink as well. I mean, they're not even that close together. So if you want to get a warm hand wash, you either fill the basin with water, so you've got it at the temperature you want, or you sort of do that with the water, alternately scalding and freezing yourself. But there is actually a reason for that, and it's to do with the water system. You see, again, because of bloody Napoleon, they were worried about invasion, and they were worried about lack of water. So houses started to put cisterns, water storage cisterns, in the attics, so they always were sure of some sort of water supply. And the water straight from any tap would be, just straight water from whatever the mains were. And then the water in the system would be used for not drinking, and that was the natural thing to link up to the water heater. And because they came from two different sources, the pressure was different. And there was a worry about siphoning, the hot water being sucked back into the cold water mains. And if you look at British mixer taps carefully, you will notice that there's cold coming out one side and hot coming out the other, because there are actually two separate pipes in the same tap. And that's because of the original water system. Now, a lot of people, in our house now, we don't have a tank. We've got a pressure water supply, and it just takes water from the mains and heats up whatever you want, or doesn't, and we have mixer taps. But there are still a lot of houses that have tanks in the roof, and for that reason, mixer taps have to be this sort of double-barreled thing where you don't see it, but when the water comes out, you can feel it, that usually there's cold on one side and hot on the other. All right, so that's why there are two tap. That's why there's still a lot of sinks and baths with two taps in British bathrooms, and even kitchens sometimes, although that's totally awful. Right, now, there was another thing I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah, how did America get into riding on the right? It was very hit and miss in America. Generally speaking, people on carts tended to stay in the middle of the road, because the sides of the road weren't that good. But Despite what you see in Hollywood movies, there were a lot of very large carriages in America. I mean, haulage, much bigger than in most other parts of much bigger than in England, for instance, and that's because there was more space. And they had 4 horses, and the standard thing was the driver would mount the left horse at the back. If you have 2 pairs, then the driver wouldn't be sitting on the buckboard of these big carriages. I don't know what you call them. Wagons, that's the word. He wouldn't be sitting there. He'd be sitting on that 4th horse, the back left one. Well, when you're sitting on the back left horse, there would be a tendency for the wagon to drift over to the right side of the road. And that's how there was this tendency, although they started off in the middle, there was a tendency to go to the right. So when Henry Ford built his cars, he built them to drive on the right. And in any case, I think he probably had an eye to selling these cars in Europe as well. And there was a far bigger market in France, Germany, Italy, and those places than just in England. So he probably had that in mind as well. Okay, now what else? No, that's it. No more. So the point is, your habit of driving on the right side of the road, you continentals and Americans, that's all because of Napoleon. And our habit of having 2 taps in our bathrooms, that's also from Napoleon. Oh, that man was such a nuisance. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.